So, do you think yourself as being completely loved by God? I mean, just totally loved by God? Or do you have some hesitation there? Or are you burdened by some shame that makes you unfit to be loved by God? Well, if you've ever felt unworthy or unfit for God's love, you are in really good company. I've been with you there many times myself. But more importantly, for the point of today's gospel, Peter is right there, unfit for the love of God. So we are in the third week of our Easter message series entitled, This Changes Everything. So last week we heard Father Mike, and he encouraged us to cast our healing shadow upon others. And so he was focusing on the first reading last week, which was from the Acts of the Apostles, which is about the early years of the church, right after the resurrection. And he spoke to us about an account of St. Peter's ministry years after the resurrection. And he focused on how Peter could heal people just by casting his shadow upon them. A pretty super power, if you ask me, better than any Marvel comic I've read or movie I've seen. Cast your shadow on somebody and it can heal them. A few years after the resurrection, we heard in that account from the Acts of the Apostles that Peter is an incredible instrument of the power of God's love. But let's roll back the clock a few years and look at St. Peter in today's gospel. Today's gospel comes to us from, as you heard, the third appearance. Jesus appears to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. That's a very important detail. It's also known as the Sea of Galilee. That's where the disciples were before Jesus even, recruited them. And so they've gone back there soon after the resurrection. The disciples have left Jerusalem, they've returned to their hometown, and they go back to what they were doing before they met Jesus. And Peter says, and I'm paraphrasing, we've got nothing better to do, so let's go fishing. Right? And they go. It's almost as if Peter wants to go back to what was familiar and fish for answers. What was the meaning of the last 3 years and all those experiences we had with Jesus? So off they go in their boat, but they catch nothing all night long. They fish all night and they catch nothing in the darkness. There's that theme of darkness and light. In the darkness, they catch no fish. They're disconnected from Jesus. Now the light of dawn is appearing. Jesus is on the beach. He's prepared a charcoal fire and he's cooking fish for their breakfast. But he shouts to them and tells them to cast their nets off to the right side of the boat. And immediately they get an abundant catch of fish. And the abundance is parallel to the abundance we heard about in Jesus' first miracle in Cana, when he changed all that water into wine. So they are once again in the light. Jesus is there. It's dawn. They're connected to Jesus, and they experience abundance of life. So as I said, this is the third appearance after the resurrection. So it comes after Peter's denial on the night before Jesus' crucifixion. We know that on that night, around a charcoal fire, Peter is asked 3 times, aren't you with him? Aren't you one of his disciples? And 3 times, Peter denies ever even knowing Jesus. And in each of the previous appearances of Jesus to his disciples, Peter is not mentioned, which is unusual because Peter is the head honcho. I mean, he is apostle number 1. And for him not to be mentioned is unusual. Peter may have been marginalizing himself, kind of like keeping a distance from Jesus because of his denial. Peter is carrying a lot of baggage, a lot of shame. And his denial is as much a betrayal of Jesus as Judas. Peter and Judas are equal in that effect. The difference is that Peter has not killed himself physically. He is, however, killing himself spiritually with his shame. I imagine Peter is feeling unworthy of Jesus' love. Now, this is where the story gets very interesting. And I want to invoke a sensation or an experience most of us have had, right? Have you ever been in a situation which, you had some sort of a tiff or an argument or disagreement with somebody at home or work or school or a neighbor, and it never got resolved? It's just hanging there. And then all of a sudden you find yourself, both of you are at the same function or the same family party or something like that, right? Awkward. We'd say that there was a huge elephant in the room, or in the case of the gospel today, there's a huge elephant on the beach. And Peter did not want to admit that it was there. But Jesus initiates the healing process, and he asks Peter 3 questions. They sound the same, but they're similar. They're not the same. And Jesus asks Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Simon, son of John, do you love me? Simon, son of John, do you love me? Now, when we read this passage, we might be confused by why Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me 3 times? Why would you say he asks him that 3 times? Nice and loud. There are 3 denials, and Jesus makes him affirm his love 3 times, exactly. There's another reason in addition. That's got the right answer, gold star for everybody tonight. But there's also another answer. You've heard that expression, the Greeks have a word for it. The Greek vocabulary is much larger than the English vocabulary. And in each time Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? He uses a different word for love. But in English, we just, we use the same word. I love pizza, I love my mother. I mean, 2 very different things, right? 2 very different things, but we just use the same word. In Greek, they have a word for it. So I won't go into a whole Greek language lesson tonight, but suffice it to say, Jesus asked him 3 times to parallel the 3 denials, but also 3 times to bespeak 3 deep, each time a deeper level of love. So the point is this, that Jesus addresses the damaged relationship not by piling on more shame, but by renewing Peter's love. Jesus never stopped loving Peter. Jesus did not act as if nothing happened either. It's not as if he just, let's pretend nothing ever happened, because that's, as we know, in those tense, awkward situations where something goes unresolved, it never really gets resolved and it's always a little awkward. Jesus doesn't do that. He confronted Peter's sin by reminding him that he is loved. Right? What better way to lead somebody out of sin through love? Does piling on more shame ever really help somebody who's erred, who's made a serious mistake, who's sinned? No. So Peter was able to learn from his mistakes, brush himself off, and go on to be an incredible witness to the power of God's love. We heard it in the gospel, in the passage last week from the Acts of the Apostles. Just a shadow could heal somebody, right? What an incredible transformation. Do you love me? Do you love me? do you love me? So in his ministry, Peter was able to do what Jesus had done for him. Forgiveness and renewal. Not with shame, but with love. So my brothers and sisters, Jesus does not, when we mess up, Jesus isn't piling on the shame. Jesus does the same for us as he does for Peter. Every day of our lives. Jesus knows our imperfections, and Jesus loves us nonetheless. And we are called to do the same for others. The way we say, I love you to Jesus, Peter had the opportunity to be physically present to the resurrected Lord on that seashore around another charcoal fire, right, at the dawn. We don't have that same opportunity. So how do we do that? I love you, I love you, I love you to Jesus. Well, we do it by bearing witness to God's love for others, right? By helping other people to learn from their mistakes. And that when they mess up, you pick yourself up, you brush yourself off, and go on to living abundantly. We can do that for others. Because just as at times in our own lives we might have been mired in the shame of our own faults, we can show other people that the way out of that is through love, not by piling on more shame. So the Easter message to all of us, to you, is this from Jesus. Hear Jesus saying to you right now, I will always love you enough to die for you. I know you're not able to love me in the same way. Just follow me and love me by loving others. So in this Eucharist, we are celebrating our connection to Jesus in the light of truth with the abundance of his love. And if you ever feel unfit to be loved by God, hear Jesus saying this to you. I will always love you enough to die for you. I know you're not able to love me perfectly in the same way I can love you. Just follow me and love me by loving others.